Chapter 1. The disruption and observation. The fog had arrived early on that particular Tuesday, the second week of October, rolling down from the marches with its customary Welsh indifference to human schedules and settling over Thistlewick-on-Wye like a woolen compress laid upon a feverish patient. By 7 in the morning, the market square was invisible from any upstairs window. By 8, the fog had thickened to the consistency of cold porridge, and the sign above Barley and Bright's confectionery, a gilded barley sheaf entwined with a painted sugar braid, swam and dissolved in the murk above the Tudor frontage. It was Dorothea Finch, the shop's senior assistant of 11 years, who found him. She had arrived at 8:30 as always, unlocking the lower shop with her own key, intending to check the morning delivery of glucose syrup before Mr. Bright came down from his private quarters above. When he had not appeared by 9:45, a deviation from his iron routine so severe it constituted, in Dorothea's practical view, a medical event, she climbed the back staircase and knocked on the door of the upper storeroom. The storeroom, uniquely, could be locked from the inside with a drop bolt, and Mr. Bright sometimes retreated there to work with the original Victorian rate ledgers in the privacy he considered their dignity demanded. The door was bolted from within. Dorothea, who was not a woman given to hysteria, fetched the spare key kept inside a ceramic parrot on the 3rd step, used it to disengage the exterior cylinder lock, then reached through a gap in the old door frame with a piece of umbrella wire, a technique she had learned from necessity during a previous locked door incident with a faulty catch, and slid back the interior bolt. Clement Allward Bright was seated on the floor beside the recipe cabinet, his back against the oak paneling, his hands in his lap, his eyes open and looking toward the window with an expression that was not precisely peaceful. It was more accurately the expression of a man who has just been told something that he finds deeply, personally insulting. His color was poor. He had clearly been dead for some hours. What Dorothea did next was a matter of some later discussion. She did not scream. She did not touch the body. She walked to the window, looked out at the dissolved fog and the empty square, turned around with great deliberateness, and examined the room with the systematic attention of a woman who has spent 11 years keeping a complex confectionery business in accurate order. She noticed, and reported with perfect fidelity, the following 3 things before she left the room and called the police. First, on the inside of the storeroom door, pinned with a single brass tack, was a piece of wax paper on which 17 moth wings had been arranged in a radial pattern, their transparent centers all aimed inward like a compass diagram drawn by a disturbed cartographer. Second, on the counter beside the recipe cabinet, the counter on which Clement Bright occasionally rested a mug of tea and nothing else, as he was adamant about no food near the original ledgers, there was one of the shop's own toffee apples. But something was wrong with it. The toffee coating was on the inside of the apple skin. The flesh was exposed, browning, facing outward. The stick entered from the bottom. Third, on Clement Bright's left hand was a white cotton glove too small for him, beneath which, pressed flat between cotton and skin, was a dried violet. His right hand was bare. The police arrived within 20 minutes. The village constable, P.C. Alun Tregoron, a solid, thorough man who had served Thistlewick for 9 years and had dealt with, in that time, 2 bicycle thefts, 4 agricultural boundary disputes, 1 missing pig, and 0 murders, walked into the storeroom, wrote the 3 anomalies into his notebook with admirable precision, and immediately radioed for the detective inspector from Hereford. The detective inspector arrived by lunchtime. The fog had not lifted. The storeroom on the upper floor of the most photographed sweetshop in Herefordshire had been locked from the inside, contained a dead man with a wrong-sized glove and a flower pressed beneath it, a topologically inverted toffee apple, and a radial diagram made of moth wings whose species was native to 40 miles away. There were no signs of violence. There were no signs of forced entry. And in the village below, behind their closed doors and half-drawn curtains and the impenetrable fog, 4 people already knew with absolute certainty that Clement Allward Bright was dead. 3 of them had reasons they would never willingly disclose. And all 3, independently, without knowledge of each other's separate schemes, had walked into that storeroom in the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning, and had done what they had separately come to do. The 4th person knew only one of those 3 things. The fog showed no signs of lifting. It was not the detective inspector from Hereford who would untangle this particular knot. It was a small elderly lady from St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple had come to Thistlewick-on-Wye not for a murder, Murders, in Miss Marple's experience, had a disagreeable habit of arriving without invitation, but at the insistence of her niece, Mrs. Pauline Chatsworth, who owned the Y Valley Guest House on Sheep Street and who had been pressing Miss Marple for a restorative country visit since the previous spring. Miss Marple had arrived on Saturday. The murder had been discovered on Tuesday. She did not consider this a coincidence of the alarming kind. Rather, she considered it simply the sort of thing that happened in her general vicinity, in the way that some people attracted cats or inclement weather. She heard about it from Mrs. Chatsworth's cleaning girl at approximately 10:30 on Tuesday morning, received the information with the mild attentiveness she gave to all new information, and spent the subsequent hour engaged in what appeared to observers to be the wholly unrelated activity of knitting a mustard-yellow bed jacket, seated in the guest house parlor, while looking out through the fog at the market square. The recipe cabinet storeroom was 2 buildings along and 1 story up. She could not see it through the fog. She did not need to see it. By noon, she had accompanied P.C. Tregoran to the scene. He was, fortunately, the kind of rural constable who had heard of Miss Marple by local reputation and lacked the metropolitan policeman's reflexive suspicion of amateur interest, and stood in the storeroom doorway for a careful 4 minutes without touching anything, her sharp blue eyes moving with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a woman sorting beads by color. The detective inspector from Hereford, a capable but impatient man named Wyndham, had noted the 3 anomalies and filed them as theatrical staging by an unknown perpetrator. He was focused, with professional intensity, on the medical examiner's report and the question of entry and exit from a room locked from the inside. Miss Marple was not focused on any of those things. She was focused on the moth wings. Not on their species, not on their arrangement, not on the wax paper or the brass tack, though she noted all of these with quiet precision, but on a single, rather ordinary detail that none of the professionals in the room appeared to have considered relevant. The moth wings had been pinned to the inside of the storeroom door. Not to the wall, not to the cabinet, to the door. This, to Miss Marple's mind, was the detail that mattered, not because of what the wings signified, but because of where they had been placed. "You see," she said softly to P.C. Tregoran, who had taken to standing slightly behind her left shoulder in the manner of a man who has decided that proximity to a certain intelligence is worth a social awkwardness. If one wished to leave a message, one leaves it where it will be found. And if one leaves something on the inside of a door, one either leaves it for the person inside the room, or one leaves it for the person who will be the first to enter, after the person inside the room has died. P.C. Tregoran wrote this down without fully understanding it. He had the sense not to say so. "The moth wings," Miss Marple continued, tilting her head at an angle that made her look very like a small, perceptive bird, "are not a message to the investigators. They are a communication between parties who were already here." She paused. "It reminds me, rather, of the arrangement we had in St. Mary Mead with the verger's wife and the bell rope signals. 3 pulls meant one thing, 4 meant another. You would never have understood it unless you already knew the code. And if you knew the code, you would know it wasn't meant for you." She smiled at the wings with the fond disapproval she reserved for clever arrangements that had gone slightly wrong. "But codes, you see, always fail eventually. They fail because the person who leaves them cannot resist making them too precise." She did not at that point share with D.I. Wyndham or P.C. Tregoran that the radial arrangement of 17 moth wings struck her, with growing certainty, not as an aesthetic gesture or a dramatic flourish, but as a counting mechanism. 17, specifically. She had already begun, with the quiet industry of a woman sorting household accounts, to count the people in Thistlewick-on-Wye who had had significant business dealings with Clement Allward Bright in the last calendar year. She finished her count by tea time. The number was, of course, 17. She said nothing about this to anyone. She accepted a cup of tea from Dorothea Finch, who had been asked to remain available for questioning, and who had responded to grief, or shock, or some private emotion none of the investigators had yet correctly identified, by making an enormous batch of vanilla fudge and distributing it among the police and anyone else in the building. Miss Marple accepted a piece, noted that the texture was slightly short, overbeaten sugar perhaps, and thought about the fact that a woman with 11 years of institutional loyalty had produced fudge rather than tears. "Excellent fudge," said Miss Marple. "Thank you," said Dorothea Finch, her eyes very dry and very steady. "You must be terribly shaken," said Miss Marple. "Yes," said Dorothea Finch. Neither of them believed the other's half of that exchange, and both of them knew it. And Miss Marple found this, quietly, the most significant thing that had happened in the room all day. By Wednesday morning, the fog had thinned to a manageable haze, and Thistlewick-on-Wye was engaged in the specific social activity that small, insular villages perform in the wake of sudden death, the sustained communal act of pretending to be more shocked than one is. Miss Marple observed this with the particular clarity that long residence in St. Mary Mead conferred upon certain observations about human communities. She sat with her knitting in the public bar of the Tanner's Arms from 11 until 1, nursing a pot of tea and allowing the village to perform its bewilderment around her, and by lunchtime she had a serviceable map of the social geography. There were, among the 17 names she had counted, 4 individuals who occupied the foreground of events with the slightly over-deliberate quality of people who know they are in a story and are playing their assigned roles. Dorothea Finch, age 44, senior shop assistant and effective operational manager of Barley & Bright's for the past decade. She had, Miss Marple was reliably informed by Mrs. Chatsworth, a woman whose conversational range made her an invaluable intelligence source, been passed over for a 20% share of the business twice in 6 years, each time by Clement Bright, withdrawing from a verbal agreement at the last moment. She had no written confirmation of either promise. Her current emotional state was one of contained fury dressed in the costume of professionalism. She had spent Tuesday afternoon reorganizing the shop's stock inventory, which did not need reorganizing, with the aggressive efficiency of someone who has nowhere to put an emotion that takes up a great deal of space. Mr. Oswald Bream, age 58, the village pharmacist, whose premises sat on the north corner of Market Square, and who had, according to the pharmacist's logbook which P.C. Tregoron had photographed as part of standard scene documentation, supplied Clement Bright with a cardiac medication called Sotalol for the past 4 years. He was also Clement's nominal solicitor for a small property dispute on the edge of the village, a parcel of land that had recently, and suddenly, become relevant to a planned housing development. Bream was a dry, angular man who spoke in the careful abbreviated sentences of someone who has spent a lifetime giving information in measured doses. His reaction to the death had been, by all accounts, one of composed sorrow expressed in exactly 4 sentences, the last of which referenced the property dispute. He had not yet been asked about the property dispute by D.I. Wyndham, which he appeared to know and to find relieving. Miss Seraphina Barley, age 39, grandniece of the original founding Barley family and the only surviving Barley relation with any legal claim, however attenuated, to a share of the business. She had contested Clement's final buyout of the family stake in the county court 7 years ago, lost, and returned to Thistlewick to run the village flower stall that her grandmother had operated. She was a woman of striking stillness. She moved through the village square in the mornings, with the economy of motion of someone who has decided to need very little from the world and is both proud and privately miserable about the decision. Her reaction to the news had been to open her stall 2 hours early on Wednesday and arrange the morning's cut flowers with an attention to geometric precision that her regulars found subtly unsettling. Miss Marple, purchasing a small bunch of late-season stocks, observed Miss Barley's hands as she wrapped them, steady, unhurried, and occupied with the almost unconscious delicacy of someone accustomed to handling small, fragile things, accustomed to handling them without crushing them. Dried violets, thought Miss Marple, accepting her change, were sold at the village flower stall. Mr. Crispin Allward Bright, age 34, Clement Bright's estranged nephew and the old man's only blood relative, who had arrived in Thistlewick from Bristol on Tuesday afternoon, some 6 hours after the death, which was either a convenient coincidence of proximity or an inconvenient problem of timing, depending on one's interpretation. He was a sleek, restless young man with his uncle's sharp bone structure softened by a generation of better nutrition, and he possessed, beneath a surface of performed grief, the barely concealed kinetic energy of someone waiting for an outcome they have already decided they deserve. He was staying at the Wye Valley Guest House, which placed him under Miss Marple's roof and made him, in her private geography of the investigation, a subject of closest range observation. She had already noticed 3 things about Crispin Allward Bright: that he had arrived with a leather overnight bag, but the bag contained enough clothing for 5 or 6 nights; that he had asked Mrs. Chatsworth with studied casualness whether Barley & Bright's had a will on file with the local solicitor, meaning Bream, or with a firm in Hereford; and that he wore at all times a faint smell of Shropshire oak wood and lanolin that was either an expensive countryside cologne or the smell of a man who had recently, and perhaps not entirely legally, been doing something in an old-growth forest 40 miles to the east. Miss Marple knitted 3 rows of the mustard bed jacket before supper and found that the pattern she had been attempting, a rather ambitious honeycomb stitch, bore a very satisfying structural relationship to the situation she was currently observing. A honeycomb pattern, she reflected, was made of identical cells. Each cell appeared complete and self-contained, but each cell shared its walls with others, and if one cell failed, the others bore the weight. The question, in both knitting and in life, was whether the cells had been constructed together or had merely, by proximity and accident, arrived at the same geometry. She suspected, with increasing conviction, the latter, which was in some ways more terrible. Detective Inspector Wyndham held his briefing in the Tanner's Arms on Thursday morning, having commandeered the function room at the back, which was ordinarily used for darts matches and the occasional birthday tea, and which still contained, along one wall, a hand-painted bunting reading Happy Retirement Bryn that no one had thought to remove. Miss Marple attended at P.C. Tregoran's quiet invitation, seated herself in the corner with her knitting bag, and was treated by D.I. Wyndham with the careful deference that a capable man gives to an elderly woman in a corner when he has been politely informed of her connection to certain past cases and has decided that the safest policy is to include her peripherally and thereby prevent her from operating entirely unsupervised. Wyndham's theory was logical, well-constructed, and wrong in every material respect. It was not wrong because Wyndham was foolish. He was not. It was wrong because he had assembled it from the visible surface of events, which had been arranged by 3 separate and uncoordinated people, to be maximally visible and maximally misleading. The theory was as follows. Clement Bright had died of a cardiac event, possibly accelerated by a substance introduced into his system, likely via his evening medication. The primary suspect was Oswald Bream, who both supplied the medication and had a financial interest, the land dispute, in Clement's death. The locked room was explained by a rarely noted feature of the Tudor building, an exterior ironwork bracket on the upper story, running along the outer wall, which a physically fit person could theoretically have used to enter via the storeroom's a single window, then exited the same way, pulling the window sash down and allowing the interior bolt to fall by gravity into its catch. This mechanism, Wyndham explained with some satisfaction, had been demonstrated in the room by P.C. Tregoran, who was athletically built and had managed it, just barely, at some cost to his trousers. The 3 physical anomalies, the moth wings, the inverted toffee apple, and the glove, Wyndham classified as theatrical staging intended to suggest a more elaborate or supernatural scenario and thereby muddle the investigation. He thought the staging the work of Bream, whose dry, precise character he felt was consistent with the kind of cold-blooded calculation the arrangement of moth wings implied. The staging, he noted, did not work, because staging as deliberately conspicuous as this ever truly worked against a trained investigator. It was too deliberate, too theatrical. Miss Marple said nothing. She said nothing because D.I. Wyndham was entirely correct about one thing. The staging was deliberate. But he had made a very natural, very understandable error. He assumed that the 3 bizarre elements had been placed by one person, for one purpose. He had not considered the possibility that each of the 3 bizarre elements had been placed by a different person, each unaware of the others, each pursuing their own separate and unconnected objective, and that the resulting accumulation of stagecraft had created, by the purest accident of overlapping private schemes, something that looked precisely like the work of a single theatrically minded killer. Miss Marple had seen this kind of thing before. Not with murder, the specific scale was new, but with the annual village fete in St. Mary Mead, in the year that 3 different committee members had each, independently, decided to move the tombola table to a different location, each leaving a note for the others. And the result had been an tombola table that moved 4 times in a single morning, while the notes accumulated into an apparently coherent set of instructions that, taken together, made absolute logical sense and were entirely the product of chaos. The principle, she reflected, was the same. The scale was admittedly rather more serious. "Yes," she said, when Wyndham had finished and asked if she had any questions. "I think you're quite right that the staging was deliberate and carefully thought through." She paused. "I wonder, though, have you established yet who prepared Mr. Bright's medication on Monday evening?" whether it was made up by Mr. Bream or collected by someone else, or whether Mr. Bright dispensed it himself as he sometimes did from his own supply. Wyndham looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has just been handed an additional piece of work at the end of a long day. "We're looking into that." "Of course," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I only ask because the medication itself seems rather a clear avenue, and I wondered whether anyone had noticed whether there were 3 bottles of Sodalol in the cabinet, or 2 or 1. She smiled. "In St. Mary Mead we had a very similar difficulty with a bottle of iron tonic in old Colonel Haswell's medicine chest. 3 people had separately added to the same bottle for what each of them believed were entirely sensible reasons. The cumulative effect was, as I recall, rather dramatic, though happily not fatal. The doctor was quite baffled until we counted the doses." She returned to her knitting. Wyndham looked at P.C. Tregoran. Tregoran, who had been writing very fast, underlined the words 3 bottles twice. Chapter 2. The illusion Miss Marple conducted her first substantive conversation of an investigative nature on Thursday afternoon, in the kitchen of the Y Valley Guest House, over a pot of tea and a plate of Welsh cakes that Mrs. Chatsworth had made with some nervous energy and slightly too much mixed spice. Her subject was Crispin Allward Bright. She had not arranged this. It had arranged itself in the way that conversations with idle young men in small guest houses tend to arrange themselves. He had been at loose ends in the sitting room. She had been coming downstairs from her room with her knitting, and the natural gravity of a comfortable kitchen had done the rest. She had learned, over many decades, that the most revealing conversations were those that the other party did not recognize as interviews. The secret was to begin with something entirely unrelated, to maintain a consistent atmosphere of comfortable inconsequence, and to wait. People, young men especially, and especially young men under the pressure of concealed anxiety, filled comfortable silences with exactly what they were most trying not to say. She began with the Welsh cakes, then moved, with the smooth inevitability of a stream finding its gradient, through the weather, the fog, the view from the guest house window, the view from the storeroom window which she described with mild interest, and the general matter of the upper story of the Tudor building. "Did you ever visit your uncle in the storeroom?" she asked, with the air of someone asking whether he had ever tried the local cider. "Once or twice," Crispin said. "Years ago. He was very particular about it. I imagine. Those original recipe ledgers are extraordinary things to be responsible for. I understand they date from 1887. There must be a great deal of, well, historical value attached to them. Not only sentimental." Something shifted in Crispin's face. It was small and quick, and he covered it with the reflexive social facility of someone who has had reason to practice covering things. "I suppose your uncle never spoke to you about the recipes themselves, as a family matter? Whether they would, for instance, form part of the estate?" "The business and the recipes were always separate conversations," Crispin said, and then stopped because he had said something specific, which meant he had been thinking about something specific, and he clearly realized this a fraction too late. Miss Marple nodded serenely. "I only ask," she said, "because the solicitor in Hereford, not Mr. Bream, the other one, apparently holds a rather interesting document relating to the recipe ledgers separately from the business assets. I heard this from Mrs. Chatsworth, who heard it from the butcher, so it may be entirely wrong. Village information," she added with a smile of self-deprecating resignation, "is so often a little tangled." The information about the Hereford solicitor was entirely accurate. She had confirmed it that morning by telephone. She had not heard it from Mrs. Chatsworth. But Crispin Allward Bright could not know that. He was, she observed, very carefully not reacting. The over-controlled stillness of a young man who has just heard a piece of information he already possessed, and is working extremely hard to appear as though he has not. "How interesting," he said. "Yes," agreed Miss Marple. "Your uncle sounds as though he was a very thorough man, very careful about separating things, keeping things in their own compartments. Some people are like that." She selected a Welsh cake. "In St. Mary Mead we had a solicitor, Bunt, very similar sort of man, very meticulous about compartmentalization, and it always made things rather complicated after his death because the compartments didn't all know about each other. Terribly inconvenient for everyone." She paused, buttering the Welsh cake with gentle precision. "Of course, it also meant that the person who knew about all the compartments was in a very particular position." Crispin set down his teacup. "You knew about all the compartments," said Miss Marple, pleasantly, to her Welsh cake. The silence that followed lasted approximately 8 seconds. Miss Marple counted them. "I don't know what you mean," said Crispin. "No, of course not," said Miss Marple. "More tea?" She had learned what she needed to know. Crispin Allward Bright had known about the separate legal status of the recipe ledgers. He had not learned this from his uncle, with whom he was estranged. He had learned it from someone who had access to his uncle's private legal arrangements. There was only one person in Thistlewick-on-Wye with that access, Oswald Bream, who was not simply Clement Bright's pharmacist and property solicitor, who was, it increasingly appeared, the person who had been quietly informing at least one other party about the internal architecture of Clement Bright's estate, possibly for reasons that had very little to do with either pharmacy or property law. Miss Marple knitted the first row of what would become, by the end of the investigation, a completed sleeve. On Friday morning, D.I. Wyndham arrived at the Tanner's Arms function room, looking satisfied in a way that immediately made Miss Marple feel a cautious anxiety. Satisfied was, in her experience, the expression on a man's face when the evidence had obliged him. Evidence that obliged was, in her experience, evidence that had been placed there to do exactly that. The new development was a small receipt, found wedged behind the iron wastepipe in the storeroom, clearly having been pushed there and partially obscured but not sufficiently, in a way that suggested either carelessness or intention. It was a receipt from a specialist chemical supplier in Shrewsbury for a quantity of potassium chloride in a concentration and form suitable for pharmaceutical use. The receipt was dated 6 weeks previously. It was made out to O'Bream Pharmacy. Potassium chloride, D.I. Wyndham explained, was associated with cardiac arrest. Administered in sufficient concentrated dose intravenously or orally in certain forms, it was lethal. A pharmacist would know this. A pharmacist would have access. A pharmacist with a financial motive, the land dispute, now confirmed as a parcel worth nearly £400,000 under the proposed development, had now apparently left a receipt connecting himself directly to a substance capable of killing a man with a compromised cardiac history. It was very tidy. It was beautifully tidy. It was so tidy that it reminded Miss Marple with considerable force of an incident she had witnessed at the St. Mary Mead Women's Institute raffle, in the year that someone had placed a winning ticket inside another member's coat pocket in order to cause a scandal. The placement had been so precisely arranged. The ticket was the right denomination, the right series, the pocket genuinely belonged to the target, that it had almost worked. Almost. It had not worked because the person who placed it had made the ticket too clean. Raffle tickets, in Miss Marple's experience, picked up a light dusting of powder from the hands of the person who purchased them. The planted ticket had been perfectly clean. No powder, no natural oil from handling. It had been managed, not bought. "Mr. Bream," said Miss Marple to P.C. Tregoran, while Wyndham was dealing with a telephone call, has been supplying Clement Bright's medication for 4 years. He handles pharmaceutical documents, proper official ones, constantly. If he were to keep a receipt for a private chemical purchase, where would he keep it? Tregoran thought about this. His office, or his dispensary files. Quite. Not behind a wastepipe in someone else's building. She turned the information around in her mind, like a stone on a palm. "The receipt is genuine. I'm sure it is. That's rather the point. Mr. Bream did purchase that potassium chloride. Almost certainly he purchased it for a legitimate pharmaceutical purpose that he will be entirely able to document. The question isn't whether the purchase happened. The question is how the receipt arrived behind that waste pipe." She said this quietly, and Tregoran wrote it down, and Wyndham returned from his telephone call in a state of continued satisfaction, and Miss Marple said nothing else, because she did not yet know which of the 3 people she was watching had placed the receipt, and she had learned over many decades that one should not eliminate a hypothesis one was not certain had been proved. But she noticed, when she next passed the flower stall on Market Square, that Seraphina Barley was wearing, on her right wrist, a small bruise of the kind produced by sudden, forceful gripping, the kind of bruise that appeared when someone grabbed a wrist in a moment of urgency. It was yellowing at the edge, suggesting it was 3 to 4 days old. Consistent, Miss Marple reflected, with a Monday evening. Consistent with someone who had gone somewhere on Monday evening they had not intended to go, had found something they had not intended to find, and had been persuaded, or forced, or had decided of their own accord, to do something that left a mark. Miss Marple spent Friday afternoon making calls of a purely social nature on 4 households in Thistlewick-on-Wye. She brought with her, in a wicker basket, a jar of her niece's gooseberry jam, a small tin of shortbread purchased from a bakery in Hereford, and an expression of the mildest possible interest in everything. The sort of expression that the truly self-involved interpreted as attention, and the truly private found unthreatening. Her first call was to Dorothea Finch's flat above the post office, on the pretext of returning a walking umbrella that Dorothea had left at the shop during the police examination on Tuesday. In practice, she wanted to see Dorothea's kitchen. The kitchen told her what she expected. It was the kitchen of a woman who was exacting, practical, and had learned over many years to work within a system that did not fully reward her. The herbs were dried and labeled with handwritten tags. The sugar in the canister was the professional-grade confectioner's variety. And on the small shelf above the bread bin, between a dog-eared paperback and a small framed photograph of Dorothea in what appeared to be a local choir, there was a ceramic pot of dried flowers, lavender, chamomile, and 1 or 2 small dried violets. Not sold, Miss Marple observed, homegrown. The dried violets were a slightly different purple from Serafina Barley's commercial stock, darker, more crimson-edged, the same variety as the one beneath the glove. Dorothea was in the kitchen when Miss Marple's eyes rested on the pot. She was making tea. Her back was to Miss Marple. She could not have seen where Miss Marple was looking. But she set the cups down on the counter with a fraction more force than was necessary. Miss Marple asked, with perfectly genuine warmth, about the choir photograph, and learned that Dorothea had sung alto in the Thistlewick Choral Society for 12 years, that rehearsals were on Mondays, that the rehearsal room was in the church hall 3 minutes from the market square, and that rehearsal on the preceding Monday had ended at 9 o'clock. The post-mortem had established the time of Clement Bright's death as between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Dorothea had finished choir at 9. The storeroom door bolt could be reached through the door frame gap with a piece of wire. Dorothea knew the building intimately. She had a key to the lower shop. Miss Marple accepted her tea, complimented the gooseberry jam, and asked a single further question: whether Clement Bright had ever made a formal written agreement with Dorothea about the proposed share arrangement, or only verbal ones. "Only verbal," said Dorothea, with the flatness of someone stating a fact that is worn smooth and hard through years of being turned over in private. "That must have been," said Miss Marple with quiet sympathy, "very difficult." "Yes," said Dorothea. The word contained, compressed within it, the weight of 11 years. Her second call was to Oswald Bream's pharmacy, where she purchased a packet of aspirin she did not need and engaged him in a discussion of the variable quality of the autumn's blackberries, during which she established that his dispensary occupied the back room behind a locked door, that the key to this room was kept on a hook inside the counter, visible to customers who knew where to look, and that his filing system for supplier receipts was a labeled folder stored on an open shelf, which a person of even moderate intelligence could locate, remove a document from, and replace in under 3 minutes on any occasion when Bream was occupied with a customer in the front. This system had apparently been Bream's standard practice for 20 years, and he considered it entirely secure because he trusted the village implicitly. Miss Marple did not say that the village was the problem. She paid for her aspirin and left. Her third call to Serafina Barley was brief. She bought another small bunch of flowers, asked whether the violets were her own or commercial, received a clipped confirmation that they were from the commercial wholesaler, and noticed, for the second time, that Serafina's hands, for all their usual studied steets, were picking up the flower stems and setting them down in a pattern that was entirely repetitive, entirely unconscious, and entirely the habit of someone rehearsing, in their hands, a sequence of actions they were trying to process mentally. She was counting something, or recounting it. Her fourth call, to Crispin Allward Bright at the guest house, was the most informative, because she did not make it at all. She simply observed that, on her return to Y Valley Guest House at 5:30, his leather overnight bag was now stored under his bed rather than in the wardrobe, a detail visible through the open door as she passed in the corridor, and that his shoes, which had been clean on his arrival Tuesday, now bore a thin line of reddish clay at the heel edge consistent with the specific soil composition of the riverside path at the eastern edge of the village. He had been to the river, or to the woods beyond it. Miss Marple went to her room, looked at the heel of one of her own shoes from habit, found it clean, and felt a small, clear satisfaction. Saturday morning arrived with a disturbance that was precisely calibrated to destroy the current shape of the investigation. At 8:15, someone broke into the recipe cabinet storeroom. not very skillfully. The exterior cylinder lock, newly fitted after Tuesday's examination, was forced with what the attending officer described as a blunt implement applied to the keyway, possibly a screwdriver, producing obvious visible damage and the kind of noise that, had anyone been in the building, would have been clearly audible. As it was, the shop remained closed following the death, and the building had been empty since Thursday evening when the last of Wyndham's team had completed their documentation. The intruder had gone directly to the recipe cabinet. The cabinet had 3 drawers. The bottom drawer, containing the 1887 original foundation recipes, the ones for the 2 flagship products that formed the basis of the business's national reputation, had been forced open. The recipe ledgers were intact and undisturbed, but inside the drawer, beside the ledgers, was something that had not been documented in any of the police photographs from Tuesday. A second folder, flat, containing a sheaf of papers that were now missing. P.C. Tregoran, who had worked with the original scene documentation, was certain the folder had not been in the cabinet on Tuesday. D.I. Wyndham was equally certain it had not been introduced during his team's access Thursday. This left an approximately 30-hour window in which the folder had been placed in the cabinet and then removed by the intruder, a performance of remarkable boldness or remarkable desperation. Miss Marple, informed of this development by Tregoran's slightly breathless telephone call to the guest house, sat with the information for a long moment before responding. The folder was placed in the cabinet, she said, after Tuesday's police documentation, and removed this morning. Yes, ma'am. So it was placed by someone who knew the police had already finished photographing the cabinet's contents, and removed very quickly once it became clear the investigation was moving in a particular direction. She paused. Was the folder placed there in order to be found by the police, or in order to be retrieved later? Tregoran was silent. If it was meant to be found, Miss Marple continued, the intruder would not have retrieved it before we found it, which means it was placed there for safekeeping, or as a threat, and has now been collected by someone who changed their mind about leaving it. The contents of the missing folder, she was now nearly certain, were legal documents, possibly copies, relating to Clement Bright's estate. Documents that someone had removed from another location, stored briefly in the cabinet as a precaution against discovery in their own premises, and then been forced to retrieve when events moved faster than anticipated. The forced entry, with its deliberate and artless violence, was not the work of someone who normally did this kind of thing. It was the work of someone in a hurry, under pressure, acting without their usual composure. The blunt screwdriver applied to a keyway was not the act of a person who had, 4 nights ago, entered a locked room through a window bracket with sufficient calm to arrange 17 moth wings in a radial pattern. 3 different people, still. But one of them was now frightened, and frightened, in Miss Marple's experience, was nearly always the precursor to a mistake. She asked Tregoran to establish, with as much precision as possible, where each of the 4 key suspects had been between 7 and 9 on Saturday morning. The disruption had served its immediate purpose. It had shocked D.I. Wyndham out of his tidy, bream-centered theory and sent him careening toward an entirely new set of questions about the recipe ledgers and industrial espionage. But for Miss Marple, it had done something far more useful. It had confirmed that the 3 overlapping private schemes were beginning to feel the friction of proximity. The threads were pulling against each other, and when 3 concealed actions began pulling in different directions, the knots always, eventually, showed. By Saturday evening, the how of Clement Bright's death had become clear to Miss Marple, though she said nothing about it publicly. She had said nothing publicly about a number of things, and D.I. Wyndham had begun to look at her corner of the function room during briefings with the expression of a man who is aware that something important is being accomplished behind a perfectly agreeable social facade and has no formal mechanism for addressing this. The post-mortem results arrived at lunchtime. Clement Bright had died of hypertensive crisis complicated by acute cardiac arrhythmia with elevated blood levels of a naturally occurring glycoside compound consistent with, though not definitively attributable to, ingestion of a concentrated preparation. The medical examiner noted, with professional caution, that the elevation was within a range theoretically produced by a significant dose of a common substance available in multiple forms, including, and this point was made with the careful brevity of a person who knows they are producing a crucial sentence, a very concentrated form of a commercially available confectionery ingredient. Confectionery ingredient. Miss Marple read the 4 words in P.C. Tregoran's summary notes and felt the satisfying, slightly melancholy sensation of a hypothesis confirming itself. The confectionery business maintained in its storeroom adjacent to the recipe cabinet a supply of working ingredients for demonstration batches and experimental recipes. These included concentrated botanical extracts, rose oil, violet essence, and a number of herbal preparations used in the production of the specialty sugar braids. One of these, a concentrated foxglove extract used historically in an 1890s recipe for a floral fondant that had been discontinued in 1923 but whose formula remained in the ledger, was a glycoside compound. It was not listed among the current stock inventory. This was not unusual. The inventory covered active ingredients, not historical ones. Someone had known about the foxglove extract. Someone who had intimate, operational knowledge of what was kept in that storeroom above the levels of the current active inventory. Someone who had been in the building and in the storeroom for years. Dorothea Finch, who had choir at 9 on Monday evening, who grew her own dried violets, who had spent 11 years acquiring not only institutional loyalty but encyclopedic operational knowledge of every bottle, jar, and preparation in the building, and who had, Miss Marple was now certain, come to the storeroom after choir on Monday evening with the foxglove extract and administered it, somehow, to Clement Bright, possibly in a drink prepared and left in the storeroom, which Bright habitually consumed alone while working late with the ledgers on Monday evenings, possibly more directly. But here was the complication. She had not been the only person in the storeroom that night. Crispin Allward Bright had also been there. She was now certain of this. The Shropshire clay on his heels, the specific wax paper used for the moth wings, a specialist tissue used in entomological collections, available from a nature supplier outside Ludlow, accessible from the old-growth forest 40 miles east, and the fact that the moth wing arrangement, with its 17-point radial structure, was a counting and signaling mechanism meant for someone who would understand its reference. Seraphina Barley had also been there. The dried violet, commercially sourced, which Dorothea would not have used. Dorothea grew her own, placed beneath the white cotton glove. The gloves were the archival type sold at the Ludlow Antique Market, where Seraphina was known to trade in Victorian decorative items, had been Seraphina's mark. Not a clue left for the police. A signal, her own kind of signal, placed on a dead man's hand. 3 people in the storeroom between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m., 3 separate purposes, 3 separate discoveries, each arriving to find at a different hour that something had already been done, and choosing, each of them, separately, with their own private calculus, to proceed with their own plan anyway. Miss Marple looked at the ceiling of her guest room for a long moment, her knitting still in her lap, the mustard sleeve half completed. The who would require one more day, because knowing who had administered the substance was not in this case the same as knowing who was responsible for the death. That was the most terrible part of Mode 1. The who was distributed. It was shared, like a wall between honeycomb cells. Chapter 3. The psychological pressure Sunday was a day of deliberate quiet for Miss Marple, and of increasing private pressure for the 4 people she was watching. She attended morning service at the Church of St. Talo, a Norman structure of considerable atmospheric draftiness, not from particular piety but because village churches, in her experience, were the social pressure chambers of small communities where people who spent a week constructing careful public faces were required to sit in proximity to each other in silence and maintain them without the distraction of activity. Under those conditions, things showed. Dorothea Finch sat in the 3rd pew from the front and studied the order of service with the fixed intensity of someone reading a complex contract rather than a liturgical program. Oswald Bream was not present, which was notable. He was, according to Mrs. Chatsworth's morning intelligence, a consistent churchgoer of 23 years standing. His absence had been noted by at least 6 people within Miss Marple's earshot. Seraphina Barley sat at the far end of the back pew and appeared, from the set of her shoulders and the direction of her gaze, not at the altar but at the side door, to be calculating exit logistics. Crispin Allward Bright attended, which surprised Miss Marple. She had not expected it of him. He sat 2 rows behind Dorothea and did not, as far as Miss Marple could observe, look at her once. After the service, standing on the path in the thin October sunshine with a cup of coffee from the parish table, Miss Marple engaged in the kind of warm, inconsequential conversation about the sermon that gave no information whatsoever, but required one's social attention. The real work was peripheral. She was observing what the four of them did when they were in the same physical space, and each aware with varying degrees of certainty that the investigation was moving toward a conclusion. What she observed was this: they did not look at each other, not in the furtive, over-controlled way of people avoiding deliberate eye contact. That was too studied, too theatrical. They moved through the churchyard, as though the others were simply not present in their field of attention, as though each of them had, overnight, committed to a complete severance of peripheral awareness. It was the movement of people who were each, separately, constructing their own account of events, and had decided, with the instinct of the cornered, that the safest policy was to have absolutely no further contact with anyone who might complicate that account. They were not communicating. They were not colluding. They had never been communicating. They had never been colluding. That was the point. That was, in a sense, the whole of it. Miss Marple accepted a second cup of coffee and allowed herself the small private admission that what she was dealing with was not in any conventional sense a conspiracy. It was an accumulation, a geological deposit of separate private grievances, separate private decisions, separate private arrivals at the same room on the same night, each following their own logic with complete independence. And the result was a death and a scene and an investigation that had all the surface appearance of a planned, coordinated act. She had seen something similar once in St. Mary Mead. Not the same scale, not, thank God, murder, but the principle was identical. 3 women of the village had each, for entirely different reasons, and without knowledge of the others, written an anonymous letter to the same man on the same day. The man had read the 3 letters, each speaking to a different private secret of his, and suffered a collapse. Each woman believed, and went to her grave believing, that she alone was responsible. None of them had been fully right. None of them had been fully wrong. This was worse. This was much worse. And the specific responsibility, the proximate cause, the substance in the glass, the act that had crossed the line from threatening to fatal, that still needed to be precisely established. Miss Marple did not believe in distributed moral responsibility as an escape from individual consequence. 3 people in a room was 3 people with 3 accounts to give. One of those accounts included the act that had killed a man. She spent Sunday afternoon writing a letter, not to D.I. Wyndham, not to P.C. Tregoran, to Mrs. Pauline Chatsworth, who was going into Hereford on Monday morning to collect a delivery, and who could, if she passed the offices of the county solicitor's firm on the High Street, ask a single question about the legal status of a specific bequest. Then she knitted 4 rows, completed the sleeve, cast off and folded the bed jacket with care. Monday morning, 8 days after the death, Mrs. Chatsworth returned from Hereford at 11:30 with the delivery and the answer to Miss Marple's single question. Delivered over a cup of tea in the kitchen, with the earnest, slightly breathless quality of someone who has discovered they have been a participant in something more interesting than they were told. The answer was this: the recipe ledgers of Barley and Brights had been bequeathed in a codicil to Clement Bright's most recent will dated 3 years ago, not to the business entity itself, not to his nephew Crispin, and not to the business continuation, but to a heritage charitable trust, jointly administered by a panel of 5 named custodians. One of those named custodians was Dorothea Finch. Another was Seraphina Barley. Clement Bright, for all his controlling, compartmentalizing precision, had, in a private moment of either guilt or sentiment or strategic calculation, included in his legacy a formal acknowledgement of the 2 women he had spent a combined 20+ years cheating of their rightful stake in the business. The question was, had they known? Miss Marple thought about the moth wings, specifically about the number 17. She had counted 17 people with significant business dealings with Clement in the past year, but the codicil had 5 custodians. The 17 moths had been placed by Crispin. She was now certain, as a signal, not to the police, not to the investigators, but to whoever from among his uncle's circle might understand what 17 signified. A private challenge, or a warning, or a declaration of knowledge, of a particular kind of knowledge that Crispin had obtained, almost certainly from Bream, about the structure of his uncle's estate. Crispin had known about the codicil. He had known that the recipes, the most valuable single component of the business, the component whose commercial value dwarfed the land, the equipment, the goodwill, all of it, were going somewhere he could not control. And someone had told him, Bream, who held the property documentation, who had at some point in the past year been persuaded or paid to share information about the codicil with Clement's nephew. And what had Crispin done with this knowledge? He had come to Thistlewick on Sunday night, not Tuesday afternoon, as the hotel register and the Bristol petrol receipts suggested. He had come Sunday, stayed somewhere that was not the guest house. The river path's clay on his heels was from the eastern bank, where the fisherman's shelter stood, and come to the storeroom on Monday night, not to kill his uncle, to take the codicil documents from the recipe cabinet, to remove the legal instrument that stood between him and full inheritance. But he had arrived to find that his uncle was already dead. Someone had been there before him, and then Seraphina Barley had arrived and found both of them, or their effects, already present, and had done what she came to do, which was to leave a mark, a private, personal, undeniable mark, on a dead man who had spent 30 years erasing her family's name from the business they had founded. A dried violet from his own stall, on his hand. Miss Marple set down her teacup and looked at the window with a great deal of feeling. The moth wings became suddenly, completely clear. 17, the number of people Clement had financially wronged in various ways across his career, documented in a ledger that Crispin, having obtained legal intelligence from Bream, had been compiling. A private document, an inventory of grievances, a map of motives, left in the storeroom as both a warning, I know what you did to all 17 of them, and a threat, and now they can all be suspects. A 17-point radial structure with all the transparent centers aimed inward. Not a compass, a target. On Monday afternoon, Miss Marple asked P.C. Tregoran to arrange something rather unusual. She asked him to request that Dorothea Finch, Seraphina Barley, and Crispin Allward Bright all come to the Tanner's Arms function room at 4 o'clock, ostensibly to assist D.I. Wyndham, who was to be present but not leading, with a final clarification of movements on Monday night. Oswald Bream would be asked, separately, to present at the pharmacy to provide documentation which would keep him occupied for the relevant period. The function room still had its happy retirement Bryn bunting. Miss Marple had specifically requested it not be removed. She had requested this not from sentiment but from a practical psychological calculation. Rooms that contain incongruous, slightly absurd details produce, in people under pressure, a low-grade dissonance that occupies a fragment of their attention and makes controlled performance slightly harder to maintain. The bunting would do its quiet work. She arrived early and took her usual corner with her knitting. She had brought the near-completed bed jacket. The sleeve was done. She was beginning the collar. The three of them arrived, separately, within a 4-minute window. None of them acknowledged the others in any visible way. They arranged themselves, Dorothea at the left of the central table, Seraphina at the right, Crispin standing near the window, with the unconscious spatial distribution of particles that carry the same charge and repel at proximity. Miss Marple let D.I. Wyndham begin with the formal questions, which he did with professional competence, going through the established timeline, the whereabouts on Monday evening, the relations with the deceased. All three answered clearly, carefully, and with the particular texture of people who have rehearsed their accounts to the point of factual accuracy on every point that can be verified and creative ambiguity on every point that cannot. Then Miss Marple spoke. She did not address the murder. She did not address the storeroom. She addressed the recipe ledgers. I understand, she said, with the mild, wondering tone of someone sharing a piece of pleasant news, that the codicil to Bright's will, the one concerning the heritage custodianship of the recipe ledgers, was apparently removed from the recipe cabinet between Tuesday and Saturday. I was told by the solicitor's office in Hereford that the original is held safely there, of course, so the copy that was removed makes no legal difference. She paused. But it is curious, isn't it, that someone went to the trouble of placing a copy in the cabinet and then removing it, almost as though they hadn't known there was an original already safely lodged elsewhere. She did not look at Crispin. She continued. I also understand that the foxglove extract, the concentrated one from the 1890 formula, has been accounted for in the inventory. It was decanted from a larger bottle. The larger bottle had fingerprints on it from the decanting. She let this sit. Not unusual in itself, of course. Lots of people handle bottles in a confectionery kitchen. But the decanting appears to have happened recently, within the past 2 weeks. She looked up from her knitting with the expression of polite interest she wore when talking about the weather. And I wondered, she said, whether the person who prepared the tea on Monday evening, there was a teapot in the storeroom, you know, the small traveling one, might remember whether it was a fresh pot or whether it had been prepared earlier. The room's temperature had not changed, but something in it had compressed. Dorothea Finch's hands, flat on the table, pressed very slightly into the surface. Seraphina Barley's gaze had moved, in the space of 4 seconds, from the window to Dorothea and back to the window. Crispin Allward Bright had gone perfectly still. Miss Marple completed a row of collar knitting. "I only ask," she said, "because whoever prepared that pot would know whether someone else had been in the room before them, whether they were the first person that evening or not. It was the or not that did the work. It was a door, left very slightly open, toward a possibility that was also a way out, and also a trap. It happened at 7:15 that evening. Miss Marple had expected it between 6 and 8, and had asked P.C. Tregoran to take a position, in plain clothes, and with a thermos of tea, at the corner of Sheep Street, with a sight line to the market square and to the river path behind it. What Tregoran saw at 7:15 was Dorothea Finch leaving her flat with a shopping bag, walking east toward Market Square, and, rather than turning toward the still clothes shop, continuing past it toward the rear lane and the riverside path. What Miss Marple had expected, and what Tregoran was looking for, was someone going to retrieve or destroy a physical object. The teapot, most likely, the small traveling teapot from the storeroom, which was not, in fact, the teapot still on the storeroom counter. She had seen that clearly on her visit, and had noted it was a large institutional pot belonging to the building, not a small traveling one. The small traveling teapot was Dorothea's own, brought from home, taken away after use. And because Miss Marple had introduced the specter of fingerprints on a decanted bottle with careful deliberateness, now an object of terror rather than evidence. She had been wrong about the teapot. What Tregoran reported, at 7:30, was that Dorothea had gone to the river path, removed from the lining of her shopping bag a small package wrapped in brown paper, and dropped it into the river from the stone footbridge. Tregoran, excellent man, had photographed this and had retrieved the package 30 meters downstream using the river access path and a great deal of cold water. It was not the teapot. It was a glass phial, now broken in the water but largely intact in its brown paper wrapping. The remains contained, as the subsequent analysis confirmed, a residue of concentrated botanical glycoside. The remaining portion of the foxglove extract, Dorothea Finch had kept it. This was the crucial detail that changed the shape of everything. She had not only administered it, she had kept the remainder, which meant she had not been impulsive, which meant she had been deliberate, which meant she had gone to the storeroom on Monday evening with the preparation already made and had administered it to Clement Bright's evening tea with the full intention of ending his life in a way that would appear to be a cardiac event of the kind his history made plausible. She had been first in the room. Crispin and Seraphina had come later, to a man already dying or already dead, and had, in their separate ways, left their separate marks. Dorothea had not known they were coming. They had not known about each other, and none of them had known about the moth wings until they saw them in the morning news. It was, by any measure, one of the more extraordinary configurations of human guilt that Miss Marple had encountered in a long career. P.C. Tregoran, dripping river water, brought Dorothea Finch back to the tanner's arms at 8:30. She came without resistance. She walked with the same upright, practical bearing she had maintained throughout the week, her shopping bag over her arm, her face showing the particular expression of a person who has, after 11 years of waiting, arrived at the end of a narrative they themselves constructed and now intend to stand in. Miss Marple was in the function room. D.I. Wyndham had been telephoned and was on his way from Hereford. Tregoran had made tea, correctly interpreting this as the right thing to do. Dorothea Finch sat down across from Miss Marple and looked at her with steady, open attention. "How long have you known?" she asked. "From Wednesday morning," said Miss Marple. "When you made the fudge." Dorothea looked at her. "The fudge. The texture was wrong. You overbeat the sugar. You are not a woman who overbeats her sugar. You have been making confectionery in this village for 11 years, and you are, by any professional measure, extremely competent. Overbeaten sugar is not absent-mindedness. It is preoccupation. You were thinking about something that required a great deal of your mental attention on Tuesday morning, and it was not grief." She accepted the tea that Tregoran handed her. "You were also," she added, more gently, "thinking about whether the fudge was the right response, whether making something was the right gesture. I thought that was very human." Dorothea looked at her hands on the table. "He was going to dissolve the business," she said, "sell the building. Sell the recipes. He told me 3 weeks ago. He'd had an offer from a national confectionery chain. They wanted the name, the recipes, and the Market Square property. He was going to take it. He would have made approximately £900,000 personally. He would have given me 3 months' salary and a reference. She said this not with bitterness, but with the flatness of a statement of arithmetic. He promised you a partnership twice, said Miss Marple. Twice. Written nothing. Kept nothing. And now he was going to sell, to a chain, what his family and the Barley family built across 130 years. What I had run, in practice, for the better part of a decade. Yes, said Miss Marple. I don't expect, said Dorothea with quiet precision, that what I did was right. No, agreed Miss Marple. It was not. They sat with this for a moment. The happy retirement Bryn Bunting moved faintly in the draft from the door. What about the others? Dorothea asked. Crispin and Miss Barley. They will need to account for their own movements, said Miss Marple. As will Mr. Bream, who shared information he should not have. But their actions, while reprehensible in their own ways, did not cause your outcome. She paused. A very wise person once said to me that the most dangerous moral error is to believe that because others were also wrong, what one did was therefore not fully one's own responsibility. I know, said Dorothea. I know that. Miss Marple looked at her with the complicated compassion of someone who has seen, many times, the narrow passage between understandable and wrong, and has never found it any easier. D.I. Wyndham arrived at 9:15. Chapter 4. The Grand Reconstruction. The following morning, D.I. Wyndham held a formal reconstruction in the Tanner's Arms function room. All relevant parties were present. Dorothea Finch, accompanied by her solicitor from Hereford, Crispin Allward Bright, Seraphina Barley, Oswald Bream, and Miss Marple in her corner, the mustard bed jacket now complete and folded in her basket, the knitting needles at rest. The timeline as Wyndham presented it, drawing heavily on Miss Marple's notes, which Tregoran had diplomatically transcribed into a form attributable to ongoing investigative analysis, was as follows. 3 years ago, Clement Bright, apparently seized by a private reconsideration of his behavior, adds a codicil to his will, establishing a heritage trust for the recipe ledgers with 5 named custodians, including Dorothea Finch and Seraphina Barley. He deposits the original with his Hereford solicitors and says nothing to anyone. He subsequently, without apparent irony, continues to treat both women with the same controlled self-interest he has always demonstrated. 1 year ago, Oswald Bream, who holds Clement Bright's property documentation for the land dispute, discovers, through access he should not have used, the existence of the codicil. He informs Crispin Allward Bright, who is at this point pressing Bream about the prospects of inheriting the full business estate. Bream's motivation is financial. Crispin has indicated a willingness to pay for intelligence about the estate structure. 6 weeks ago, Crispin, alarmed by the codicil and by separate intelligence suggesting Clement is considering a sale that would accelerate the distribution of assets, makes his first visit to the old-growth forests in Shropshire, where he has been purchasing moth specimens for 2 years as part of a collecting hobby, and begins preparing the materials for a planned confrontation with his uncle. The moth-wing arrangement is a document he has been constructing, a list of the 17 people financially damaged by his uncle, intended as leverage in a negotiation about the terms of the estate. 3 weeks ago, Clement Bright informs Dorothea Finch of his intention to sell to the national chain. Monday morning, Dorothea Finch, having spent 3 weeks considering her options and finding none that were legal, effective, or in any way adequate, prepares a concentrated preparation from the foxglove extract she has known about for years and has recently, discreetly decanted into a smaller bottle. She plans to introduce it into Clement Bright's evening tea, which she knows he takes alone in the storeroom on Monday evenings when working with the ledgers. She sets the preparation in her kitchen. She attends choir. She comes to the storeroom at 9:30. Monday, 9:45 p.m., Dorothea enters the storeroom via the back staircase using her familiarity with the building and the umbrella wire bolt technique, which she has used before. She finds Clement Bright already in the room, at the cabinet, with his evening tea. She adds the preparation to the pot, not the cup. She is careful, controlled, and she does not want to be seen doing it directly. She stays until he pours a second cup. She leaves. She takes the traveling teapot. She takes the remaining phial. She bolts the door behind her, using the wire technique in reverse. She does not know that Clement Bright, by the time he finishes his second cup, is already experiencing the first symptoms of what will become, over the next 2 hours, a fatal cardiac crisis. Monday, 11:30 p.m. Crispin Allward Bright, who has been in Thistlewick since Sunday, comes to the storeroom via the exterior ironwork bracket, the same route Tregoran demonstrated, which requires athletic fitness and a tolerance for risk. He intends to remove the codicil copy from the recipe cabinet where, he has been told by Bream, a copy is kept alongside the ledgers. He enters to find his uncle barely conscious and the room in the state of a man in cardiac arrest. Crispin does not call for help. He finds the codicil copy in the cabinet, removes it, and, in a moment of what Miss Marple suspected was something between paralysis and cold decision, pins the moth-wing document to the inside of the door. It is his alibi, his insurance policy, and his declaration of intent. There are 17 others. Any one of them could have done this. He exits via the bracket, pulling the window sash down. Monday, 1 a.m. Serafina Barley arrives at the storeroom. She has come on a night errand she has been planning for weeks, with no knowledge of the foxglove or of Crispin's visit. She comes to place a single object on or near Clement Bright's person, the white cotton archive glove with the dried violet beneath it. It is a private act of reclamation, an assertion of the Barley family's presence in a story from which they have been erased. She finds Clement Bright dead, or nearly dead, on the floor. She kneels beside him and places the glove on his hand. She places the violet beneath it. She inverts the toffee apple, the shop's flagship product, a Barley family original recipe, as a final geometric act of reversal. What was inside is now outside. She leaves 3 people, 3 separate purposes, 1 dead man. Wyndham, with Tregoran's notes and Miss Marple's reconstructed timeline, proceeded methodically through the private deceptions of the supporting cast. Not all were criminal. Not all were innocent. Crispin Allward Bright's alibi, the Bristol petrol receipts establishing a Tuesday afternoon arrival, was dismantled cleanly. CCTV from a petrol station north of the Severn Bridge showed him fueling in Wales on Sunday evening. He had, as was subsequently confirmed, been in the fisherman's shelter at the eastern end of the river path from Sunday to Tuesday morning, slipping back to Bristol to establish paper evidence and return. He was charged with obstruction of justice, theft of the codicil copy, and withholding evidence of a death. Not murder, but not trivial. Bream had not committed murder and had not administered anything. He had committed a serious breach of client confidentiality in sharing the codicil information with Crispin, motivated by a quiet financial arrangement. The potassium chloride receipt had been planted, taken from his dispensary file by Crispin, who had access on a Monday afternoon visit to discuss estate matters, and placed behind the storeroom waste pipe to create a second suspect of maximum plausibility. A neat, cold-blooded act of insurance. Bream faced professional regulatory proceedings and likely the end of his pharmacy license. Serafina Barley had trespassed, interfered with a crime scene, and withheld evidence of her own presence. Her actions, Miss Marple had said carefully to Wyndham in private, were those of a grieving woman reclaiming a symbol, not those of a killer. The bruise on her wrist had come from Crispin, who had encountered her on the stairs as she arrived and he was leaving, and who had grabbed her arm in the dark in mutual panic, both of them recoiling from the encounter and fleeing without speaking. Neither had mentioned this to the other in the subsequent days. They had each kept the encounter as a secret burden, not knowing how much the other knew or intended to say. The 4 of them, in different rooms of the building on the same night, had maintained their separate silences with the discipline of people who knew, instinctively, that any disclosure risked exposing not just the specific but the general, not just what they had done, but what they had felt entitled or compelled or desperate enough to do. Miss Marple found, when she spoke to Serafina privately on the Tuesday following the reconstruction, that the woman's stillness had changed quality. It had become, if anything, quieter, less defended. "Did you know," Miss Marple asked gently, "about the codicil? About your name and Miss Finch's name in the Heritage Trust?" "No," said Serafina. "I found out the same way you did, from the Hereford solicitor." A pause. "A week too late." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "A week too late." They looked at each other in the way of people contemplating a door that will never now be opened, not because the key is lost, but because the room behind it no longer exists in the form it once did. He was going to, in his way, eventually acknowledge it, Miss Marple said. The legacy, the codicil. It wasn't nothing. "No," said Serafina. "It wasn't nothing." She began wrapping a bunch of chrysanthemums. "It was also 30 years too late." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That too." Dorothea Finch was charged with manslaughter on grounds of unlawful act. the prosecution opting against murder on the basis that premeditation, while present in the procurement of the substance, existed in tension with the psychological state of extreme and sustained provocation documented across 11 years of demonstrable professional exploitation. Her solicitor introduced the codicil evidence, the formal, delayed acknowledgement of her contribution that she had never known existed, as a factor in mitigation of moral culpability, an argument that produced, in the court proceedings that followed, a quietly devastating examination of what an institution owes the person who keeps it alive. Miss Marple did not attend the trial. She was not needed as a witness, having maintained throughout a public reticence about the precise path of her deductions that Wyndham, diplomatically, had converted into documentary form that acknowledged the investigative contributions of a local observer without requiring her presence. She did write to Dorothea Finch, a short letter, 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph said something she had said before, in similar circumstances, to different people, in the knowledge that its truth did not make it any less painful. That understanding why someone did something was not the same as saying it was right, and that the law's distinction between what was understood and what was sanctioned was not cruelty but was instead the social compact's only honest mechanism for distinguishing the deeply regrettable from the permissible. The second paragraph said something she had said to very few people, because it required a specific kind of precision to say without condescension that she believed, for what it was worth from a woman of 78, who had observed a great many lives in a great many small rooms, that the error Dorothea had made was not in the decision itself. That decision existed in a moral dimension that Miss Marple had no certainty about and no authority to fully judge, but in the belief, private and unspoken, that there was no other mechanism left, that all other avenues had closed, because they had not closed. The codicil, the document she had not known about, was, in its imperfect, belated, characteristically limited way, evidence that the man had been moving, however slowly and secretly, toward an acknowledgement that Dorothea deserved. She had acted, in other words, in a world she believed had foreclosed on her, and the world had not. And this was, in Miss Marple's private estimation, the tragedy of the whole affair. Not the dead man, whom she found it difficult to mourn with any genuine warmth. Not the legal consequences, which were appropriate, and she accepted them, but the 11 years of a specific kind of despair that had concluded, at 1 in the morning in a locked storeroom, in the only way it knew how to conclude. Because nobody in Thistlewick-on-Wye, in 11 years, had thought to hand Dorothea Finch the piece of paper that told her she had not been, all along, entirely forgotten. Barley and Bright's did not close. The Heritage Trust, administered by Seraphina Barley and 2 of the other named custodians, took legal possession of the recipe ledgers. The building was purchased at public auction by a consortium that included 3 former Thistlewick residents and 1 small investment group, on the understanding that the shop would continue to operate. Seraphina agreed to serve as creative director. The original 1887 recipes, the ones that had never been sold, never been appropriated, never been erased, were cited, with full attribution, in the new shop's founding document, the Barley and Bright Confectionery Foundation, 1887, restored 2024. The toffee apple formula was amended, in a single small note appended by Seraphina to the Heritage Archive, to include the original Barley family glaze technique that had been removed from the commercial recipe in 1986. Miss Marple did not hear about this until later, and when she did, she sat very quietly for a moment, and then returned to her knitting with an expression that was not precisely happy, but was the expression of someone who has watched a large, complicated thing arrive, imperfectly but genuinely, at a better position than the one it was in before. Miss Marple left Thistlewick-on-Wye on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the Monday of the death, in the early morning while the fog was just beginning its daily argument with the valley. She left the completed mustard bed jacket with Mrs. Chatsworth for the church raffle, or give it to someone who might use it. I find I don't need it now, and declined the offer of a later train in favor of the 7:30, which was quiet and allowed her the window seat she preferred for watching the landscape transition from Welsh marches to Midlands to the settled, familiar geometry of home. She thought on the train about the moth wings. Specifically, she thought about the fact that the lunar hornet clearwing, the species Crispin had used, had transparent patches at its wing centers, because it had, over thousands of years of evolution, developed the capacity to mimic a wasp without actually becoming one. The resemblance was entirely superficial, produced by the absence of the scales that give most moths their opacity. The clearwing was, structurally speaking, a moth that had learned to look like something it was not, by simply becoming less of what it was. She thought this was quite a precise metaphor for a number of the events in Thistlewick-on-Wye and chose, on reflection, not to share it with anyone, because it was the kind of observation that sounded cleverer than it was and required one to have studied moths, which most people had not. The real lesson of the Thistlewick case, and Miss Marple did not use the word lesson with any pleasure, it was a terrible word that made tragedy sound pedagogically useful, was one she had circled in her mind since Sunday morning in the draughty church of St. Talo. It was this, that the most dangerous lies were not the ones people told to each other, but the ones they told to themselves about their own isolation. Dorothea Finch, Seraphina Barley, Crispin Bright, and Oswald Bream had each, over years of separate private grievance, convinced themselves that they were alone in their situation, unique in their wrong, and without resource. They had each, in that conviction, taken actions that were shaped by the loneliness of the belief, rather than by the actual topology of the situation. If any two of them had spoken to each other, if Dorothea had known about the codicil, if Seraphina had known about Dorothea's partnership promise, if any of them had simply, on any ordinary Tuesday before the fatal Monday, told another human being what they were carrying, the shape of events would have been entirely different. In St. Mary Mead, thought Miss Marple, this was the function of gossip, not a gracious function, not a function one could recommend in polite society, but a functional one. The relentless, sometimes intrusive, sometimes cruel, frequently inaccurate flow of social information that characterized village life performed, for all its faults, this one essential service. It prevented the accumulation of private despair to a critical mass. People talked, they exaggerated, they sometimes caused damage, but they talked, and in talking they discharged, incrementally, the pressure of what they were carrying, and this discharge, Miss Marple had observed this for 70 years, prevented a certain specific kind of explosion. Thistlewick-on-Wye was insular in the wrong way. Its people kept their own counsel with a rigor that was, ultimately, a form of pride. And pride, as Miss Marple had observed, in every village, every drawing room, and every human heart she had encountered in a long and attentive life, was the one quality almost perfectly correlated with catastrophe. She looked out at the Midlands opening beyond the window, its flat, comfortable landscape of fields and hedgerows and ordinary lives being lived inside ordinary houses with their ordinary accumulations of unspoken difficulty. She thought about 17 moth wings pointed inward at a center that turned out to be empty. She thought about a toffee apple, inverted, about the inside turned out and the outside turned in, and whether this constituted a destruction or a correction. She thought about a dried violet pressed beneath a white cotton glove on the hand of a man who had, in the end, been moving, too slowly, too secretly, too late, in the right direction. The train entered the Midlands at a good pace. The fog was behind her. She reached into her bag, found her knitting needles, and began, with the quiet industry of a woman who keeps her hands occupied in order to allow her mind its full range of motion, to cast on the first row of a new project. She had no idea yet what it would become. This, she had found, was almost always the best way to begin.